Hello, this is Don Vanderholm, and welcome to my presentation on my problem of practice and study for Principles Research 563. More research is needed to determine whether standards-based grading provides an effective and equitable system of college readiness when compared against traditional grading practices for rural high school students, regardless of gender, language status, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or grade level. And so that's what I propose to look at in my research study. So why standards-based grading? Some of the main points for this study: we have an outdated grading system that's been around for 100 years. Some would argue, and many would argue, that it's time for a change. All high school students must be prepared for that next level after high school into a world that is ever changing in the job market and careers. For a long time, we've had an achievement gap that in many cases, have not closed, and educators are looking for new solutions and new ways to close those gaps. And then there's those limits that I mentioned for rural marginalized students that in some ways go beyond the typical urban school setting. So let's talk about each of these points. First of all, readiness. Research has a lot of different things that they put into the bucket of what makes a student ready for college. Certainly been a lot of questions over the years about GPA and grade inflation. High stakes testing is something that we're seeing more and more looked at as far as it's been adapted and changed to try to fit more to predict more accurately a student's readiness for college. And then a host of other things that include basic skills and knowledge, the ability to advocate for oneself, clear learning standards and expectations that can be measured diagnostically, and then students' academic growth, in many cases like the level of math that's achieved. In the rural setting, there's some specific limits to resources and opportunities for students. Scheduling is one. It's difficult to give students some of those rich experiences that they might get in a larger school setting. Counseling is limited, as well as just some of the basic programs that you'll find in a larger school setting, and especially career exploration. More and more, we're finding that we need the one-size-fits-all model just isn't cutting it. We need to have a more individualized learning. Students need to have the transition skills and the knowledge that's essential for them to move on to the next level and to have those opportunities to do whatever they want to do in life. Marginalized students are found to be the least likely to have the information that is needed in some of these transition skills and essential knowledge. And so standards-based grading really has shown some promise for those farthest away from equity in education. In the literature I've looked at, there's three areas that I wanted to focus on for this presentation, and I've chosen parts of three titles to do that. This idea of a broken grading system has pushed many researchers to look at comparisons between standards-based grading and traditional grading systems. Then there's the association between standards-based grading and traditional grading and standardized test scores, and which is the greatest predictor of success and which is the greatest, obviously has the greatest correlation of preparing students for success on those tests. And then there's that readiness for college aspect. Students need to know how to think in specific ways about content and learning. And more than just retain and apply information, they must be able to process, manipulate, assemble, reassemble, examine, question, discover patterns, organize, and present it. Least likely to have this information are students from families and communities historically underrepresented in higher education or certain career pathways. So more and more schools are turning to standards-based grading as a possible way to fill in those cognitive skill gaps and those key strategies that students need for college readiness. And now into the study. This would be a quantitative correlative study of college readiness. I propose to have a sample from 2 graduation cohorts over 2 consecutive years, looking at 2 high schools, similar demographics in rural settings, high poverty, very likely Latinx population. A main research question: what are the differences in the use of standards-based grading over traditional grading practices when it comes to preparing rural marginalized students for college readiness? So what data is going to support the outcomes of this study to determine college readiness? I've mentioned some already in the college readiness bucket, but that certainly has to be refined and narrowed down. And then my third research question: what quality control factors must be considered to make a fair comparison between the 2 grading systems? So those next steps. So like I said, 2 rural high schools with similar demographics. A possible location would be North Central Washington. Go back to the slide where I talked about college readiness factors, and you can see some of the things here that I'm looking at in my data sampling, as well as perhaps some of those key components that are mentioned in the Conley study. And finally, I want to point out the ethics and quality measures, the assumptions and limitations of the study, and the significance to education. Having been a high school principal who implemented standards-based grading, I recognize my own personal bias in this topic, and it's important that I'm able to pull back and set that aside so that I can do a fair and objective comparison. It's quite likely I will be selecting schools that I am somewhat familiar with, so it's really important that I am conscientious of protecting the identity of staff, students, and even the school districts. And then under that data collection process, it's really important that, again, I define and narrow down what practices contribute to college readiness. Some assumptions and limitations of the study. One assumption is that the schools I select are using standards-based grading as intended. It will be assumed that the school system has provided adequate professional development and support to their staff, and that training has taken place, that the use of standards-based grading is being monitored and adjusted as needed. And then some of the limitations of the study come under a how-to list. How will I define the methods used to predict college readiness? Define the practices of traditional grading systems versus standards-based grading that contribute to college readiness. Determine the effective use of these practices in order to select schools that will provide an accurate sampling of each. And finally, how to account for the element of subjectivity in all grading that may present an element of variance which could compromise the reliability of the study. I do believe the study has significance for educators. With more administrators looking to close achievement gaps and provide students farthest from social justice with equity in education, they are looking to standards-based grading as a possible solution. So it's important that we continue to provide relevant data for those considering that switch so they can make the best decisions for implementation. Most, if not all, school districts have initiatives and learning targets in place that talk about college readiness. So it's important that we continue to look at how standards-based grading might be used to provide accurate information on student progress towards college readiness that can then be used to establish those grade level benchmarks and content expectations that high schools especially need in order to make sure that students are making that adequate progress each step along the way. And of course, there is the issue of equity. And with the pandemic really illuminating a lot of the disparities that we have in educational equity, it is time for a change. So with the goal of reducing subjectivity in grading, standards-based grading may provide more accurate diagnostic information on individual student growth unaffected by other factors such as behavior, participation, or parental involvement. So a close examination of rural marginalized student subgroups is needed to determine the potential effect on providing a system that is equitable. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your feedback.